Our advocacy studio, where from time to time we have these lunches where guests and staff together join in welcoming one of the advocates from our community. And today we're real excited because we have one of the foremost immigration advocates in the country. Wafa Abdin is here, and I've known Wafa for a long time, like since we were teenagers, right, Wafa? So like 10 years ago, right? So, and Wafa works over at Catholic Charities, where she runs, this one of the largest immigration clinics in the country,
it is,
right?
Yeah, and in Houston, definitely the largest.
By far,
By
right?
far,
yeah.
Absolutely.
And so we want to learn a little bit about what's happening immigration-wise in our country, learn a little bit about Wafa's background, sort of how she became an advocate, and then certainly to open it up to questions. But Wafa, advocacy, immigration is a big deal for us right now, right? I think it's in the news a lot. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is that whenever I talk about human trafficking, I always talk about the history, my own history, and how you were the one who said, hey Bob, you need to think about this. 10 years ago, no one had heard about human trafficking, yet you were the one that got us there. But at the time, we probably thought human trafficking and immigration were more overlapping than they are now. I mean, we were sort of finding this whole other world around human trafficking. But today, as we speak, immigration is sort of one of the topics of the hour because of President Trump and sort of this whole climate within our country. When you think about your work and the people that are working with you, Wafa, how has that climate impacted you guys?
Well, actually, it's really changed life for us completely, I would have to say. So, as you all know, after the president started, within a month he, introduced 2 new executive orders, and usually executive orders are, kind of orders from the president to a directive for the agencies to do or not to do something, and then within a month or 2 he had the third. And so the first one was about the interior, and mostly what it did, it really was created to really open door for an easier way of deporting, detaining, immigrants who are, have any kind of immigration violation. And then the second one was about the border. So we heard the talk about, the wall, and then increasing the number of border patrol and, kind of creating more or building more detention centers. And the third was about Muslim countries and refugees. So, and right after the first 2 were, out there, then USCI, the Department of Homeland Security, which really, implements these policies, issued 2 memos that completely changed the way we do immigration. So since 2014, President Obama at that time, through the Department of Homeland Security, issued a memo that kind of decided about priorities. Who is going to be the one subject to deportation? As you know, we have, more than 11 million, kind of people who are unauthorized or undocumented in the U.S. There's no way you can deport. So they put the emphasis mostly on those who have committed, serious crimes. So people, who had that knew they were the priority, and they really deported a lot of people. But for instance, for us now, once the memos were out, no more priorities. So everybody became a priority. So a crime victim, lots of times because of the situation they're in, because of domestic violence, for instance, sometimes they end in being in deportation proceedings just because the abuser does not allow them to go to follow up on their cases and things like that. So what we used to do, there was a process by which they can report to ICE. I mean, we file for their application, and then they go to the enforcement, and they report like monthly, some of them every 3 months, and they knew, they go there, and it's really kind of, they come back home. So what happened after the new memo, so even crime victims who did not have any criminal convictions, we had very recently a story in El Paso. She went to report. She's been reporting for the last, I think, 4 years, and her kids were at school. Poof, she was deported. So that's kind of really changed a lot how we do work. The other thing that happened, there was a lot.
What's the percentage of increase of people that are getting deported? Because we know apparently under Obama there was a lot of deportation, but what has that increase looked like?
I mean, I don't think we still have very accurate numbers. People kind of, seem to think like 30%, but it's really more, I would say, in terms of who is being deported that has changed tremendously. The other thing, like, let's say, ICE is knocking at a door and they were looking for someone. They used to take that someone. Now they ask about everybody who's in the house, whoever there is unauthorized, is at the danger of being deported. Some of the main changes too is that anybody within 100 miles of the border and have been here less than 2 weeks, they can be expeditedly removed without any due process. They don't have to go to court, nothing. I mean, they just can deport them. Now this was extended to all of the U.S. and within 2 years of being in the country. So, so it created so much fear among the community, because even if you've been here, like, let's say 4 years, what do you carry with you as an immigrant to prove you've been here more than 2 years? And we have seen that deportation can happen right away. So a lot of what we do now, in addition to kind of handling the cases and all of that, we've been doing Know Your Rights presentation. We're, helping people understanding their rights and also prepare them if this happens and the kids are left at the school, not being able to, go home and nobody to pick them up. So in addition to that is all this, the reviving of the partnerships with the local police. So there's always been these programs. I mean, they've been, for years. And we have 287G and secure communities. So what happened towards the end of, President Obama's time, these were getting not popular and they were not renewing them. So, but now there is this emphasis even, that people could be penalized, if they don't. So we have them being defunded from getting any federal money, and also they have to be joining. I've been involved with the transition team for the new sheriff, and he decided to stop 287G, and so we were excited. But then 14 of the surrounding kind of counties now have started to sign this. So and this of course erodes the feeling of security for the community, because they think of the local police, they're for us to call when we have an issue to protect us, but this has affected them. Like the HPD actually new chief said that there was a 42.8% less calls from victims to ask for help from the police from starting March.
So 48% fewer calls to the police for help,
especially from the Hispanic community.
And do we think that's because we know
absolutely
that's because they're sort of worried that there's someone in the family who could be deported?
Absolutely. Because they're afraid if the actual local police is going to act like an immigration officer and ask them about their documentation, so the fear would stop them from reaching out to the police. And the third, which is really not completely immigration but very related, was the banning first of the 7 Muslim countries, and that was a mess. So the minute this was issued, people who even were not from these 7 countries were stopped at the airport, and also we had refugees who were supposed to be coming, like who were vetted for 2-3 years. They were
had green cards
and they were asked to leave the airplanes. There were some even green card holders that were asked to sign to give up their green card. It was really a mess. But I thought the community, especially the kind of legal community, responded really amazingly. So we had like in Houston, we had 300 attorneys who were ready to go, and they were sitting on the floor in the airport. And then through our work with the collaborative, we continue to have a lot of interest in continuing to do this work.
How does it feel for you, Wafa? As someone who works with immigrants day in and day out, your life has been devoted to this idea that, the Statue of Liberty says, "Send me your huddled masses." That this is a country of immigrants, right? Unless you're Native American. And how does it feel to you when you see that a great many people, maybe almost the majority of people in the country, really feel like immigration is something that's a challenge or a problem for us, when this is your life that you devoted to?
Well, absolutely. I mean, even on the personal level, let me start with that
Yeah.
kind of smaller thing. As an Arab and Muslim woman, I'm very offended, to tell you the truth, by all of this, kind of deciding that anybody who's coming from these countries is going to be either a terrorist or come to harm the country
Right.
to start with. On the level of our clients, I mean, we work with them. They're hardworking clients. They're here to create life for themselves. And now they're living in fear every day. But mainly, I feel it's un-American. I mean, for me, coming to this country, I come, from an area where we have tyrants, and we don't have as much civil rights, and it was really amazing to kind of see what we can do here. So I see now as if it's going back, and for me, it's even more frightening because people here. I mean, I believe that there are constitutions and institutions and all kinds of things that will help us not move, but it's frightening actually some of the discourse that you hear. About removing privacy rights for immigrants, the lack of due process, and prosecutorial discretion, which really helped a lot of the clients we work with who have humanitarian reasons to ask for, to be given a waiver, or it's really all of this is being eroded and it doesn't exist. I also kind of worried so much about my programs because it's also affecting the funding. So there is real danger that you will not have funding anymore. So I feel like because I supervise the immigration and the refugees. So the refugee staff, most of them are former refugees. So they're traumatized on so many levels. First of all, they're not sure they'll have a job. They're very worried about their clients every day, and they're not sure that they can continue to do the services. So it has been like, sometimes even one tweet kind of changed our life completely. But what we've decided to do, and we have a new legal director who kind of starts and legal service providers to make sure that we help the community be prepared if this happens. But I mean, it's really kind of, again, like even asylum seekers are now discouraged and they're supposed to be detained until, so I feel like even our, agreements with international agreements, our, commitment to human rights and due process, all of this is really kind of not where we were.
So how did you get into this? I mean, you grew up in the Middle East, right? In Jordan, right? Talk a little bit about that, how you grew up and Palestinian family.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Amman, Jordan. And I come from a Palestinian family with roots from Hebron and Jerusalem. So my, grandfather was born and raised in Jerusalem, but then when they knew that, Palestinians were, had to leave in 48, he wanted to avoid that. So he sent, my his older brother sent him to Amman, Jordan. So he started the business so the family would have somebody to support them. So for me, I mean, I belong to the oldest refugee in the world. Actually, we've had 4 generations who have been born and raised in refugee camps, and that's all they know. So to me, that was really what I wanted to do. But at that time, my dad was an attorney, and he was the attorney general and the governor of the 2. So I was around these things, and I was thinking I wanted to go to law school, but everybody was telling me how, girls from good families don't go to deal with criminals. And I was interested in languages, so I did English literature, and I had my master's in English.
Now, where did you go to college?
I went to the University of Jordan for my undergrad. And then I got married, went and lived in Saudi Arabia, which was a very interesting experience. My husband worked for Aramco, so it was a different world. I mean, not being able to drive outside the compound and all of that. And then he wanted to come to the U.S. to continue with hearing and balance disorders. There was a very special project with Gaza and with in Jordan, and we met the dean and he wanted to come. So we brought our 2 kids, all our savings, and we came here, which was crazy, to Lamar University of all everywhere.
So you were in Beaumont first.
In Beaumont first.
Welcome to the United States.
Everybody was telling me, how did you choose Beaumont? But they had a very special program. So when I started there, I finished my master's in English, and I taught freshman English. But then at that time, my husband wanted to work for a while, so we did our immigration work with an attorney. And it was, job related. And then he lost his job. So the $8,000 we paid went down the drain. And, we did not have no status. So at that time I thought, I'm usually very persistent and I can be stubborn. I decided I'm not going to allow the system to let me go. So the International Student Advisor gave me a booklet, and I changed our immigration status several times to keep us, legal.
Yeah.
Then I decided to go law school. And I thought it was so cumbersome and difficult and complicated. So I wanted to go to law school and help those who don't have,
Wow.
money.
And when you entered law school, were you thinking immigration at the time?
Absolutely. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to work with immigrants and refugees. So anyway, the first year was a disappointment to me because it was just the black letter law, and everybody wanted to go work for the big firms, and I was an older woman with two teenage kids, having to run home all the time, and and this was also this foreigner, so it took me a while to feel kind of at home, and I didn't really.
How long had you been in the United States when you started law school?
We came in 1990.
And you started law school?
I started in 97.
Okay. So you've been here a couple of years.
So I've been here, a couple of years. But I had no clue about the system or, kind of the federal and the state and all kinds of things. But anyway, so what really changed my experience was the third year. They created the first immigration clinic at that time.
And you're at U of H.
I was at U of H. I had surgery. I didn't know about it until they started. They took all the students. But I was going to get in one way or the other. So I kept emailing Professor Maris. And, finally she responded. She said that I was too persistent for her. So she introduced me to Joe Vail. So I went to meet him. She said, I wanted to meet this woman who everybody kept telling me, kind of interview her. So anyway, he got me in, and I did my first asylum case in the clinic. It was somebody from Somalia, from, one of the ethnic groups that was, and it was an amazing experience. And then part of what we did also, he took us to Pro Bar, near the border, and we represented clients there. So I knew that's what I wanted to do. Honestly, I kind of made up my mind. I stayed in the clinic for the whole year, and then I had a fellowship to work with unaccompanied minors. So we were doing Know Your Rights presentation. And at that time, this is a different world now. Kids were put actually, if they mess up or whatever, in actual jails. So I remember going to Liberty County and seeing one of the kids who used to be at Catholic Charities shelter, and he was there, like a beautiful young boy with pimples, and and he was from Central
Usually
America.
those don't go together, but I get what you're saying.
It was just really, and he was really kind of 12. So I thought that doesn't make any sense. So I kind of, started working with the group to find what's going on. At that time, I had worked with Catholic Charities on a pro bono case for somebody from Egypt because I spoke Arabic. So they offered me a job as a staff attorney.
Catholic Charities.
Catholic Charities. So the first time I said no, I was clerking with Gordon Kwan at that time, and I was learning so much. But then they again next time told me. So I thought, well, I've always wanted to do that. Why not go? And I thought, I'm going to be the staff attorney, so it's okay. I don't know.
And how many attorneys did Catholic Charities have?
Well, at that time there were 8 staff. I was the only attorney.
Wow.
And so once I started, I realized it's just me. I didn't know enough. So thank God I had Joe Vail was my mentor. I had, other attorneys who really helped me learn. But I had to work like 80 hours just to kind of, because, there was nobody. I ended by, then in 2 months I became supervising attorney. In a year I became the director. At that time we were like, as I said, 8 with a budget $250,000. And I started applying for representing unaccompanied minors because we had a shelter at Catholic Charities, but nobody was representing them. There were some pro bono attorneys, and they would go appear in court by themselves. So maybe I sent like 6 applications, and then, and this kind of reminds me, like September 11 happened. Things were horrible. But part of what happened after September 11, they moved the custody of kids from ICE, because ICE U.S. At that time, INS. So the same agency that is supposed to be deporting them was responsible for their custody. So it was really horrible. Then they moved it to the Office of Refugee Resettlement at that time. And then there was some funding to do Know Your Rights presentation and legal assessment. So we applied and we got the first grant. This was in 2008 when we received the first funding. I mean, I kept applying for years. And I used to be the one representing all these kids because there was nobody, and it was hard because I don't speak Spanish, but anyway. So in 2008, we had an attorney and a caseworker who was working on this. And there were like two shelters in Houston. And then this continued to grow. I mean, so now there are 8 shelters, and last year we saw 4,500 kids in detention.
And how many staff do you have now? How many lawyers do you have now?
So now I actually have, 32 attorneys.
Wow.
And 28 legal caseworkers. We have 3 family advocates. We have 1 social worker and 5 legal clerks and kind of 6 admins.
And you could be twice as big and you still wouldn't be taking care of everyone.
Oh, you can't. We can't meet even a little bit of the need. There's so much need, and that's why also part of what we do is we work with pro bono attorneys, so we can kind of are able to represent more clients.
Where do you think the change happened in this country where a significant portion of our country became anti-immigrant, or do you think it was always there and now it's more vocal, or what happened?
Well, I've always felt there were 2 kind of groups in the U.S. So there was a group that had no really connection to immigration, and they knew no immigrants, nothing about the system, and then you had those who were involved in that. But somehow it has become, and it didn't happen just with this election.
Yeah.
But we've seen, more rhetoric about, kind of, and a lot of misinformation about, how immigrants, kind of have more crimes, even though if you look at the statistics, they much less in terms of numbers. And then once you have also, I think what affected is the economic situation. Because when people start seeing that jobs are less, they always look to the other. They are the threat. So that also kind of added to it. But now it has, it kind of divided now the country in 2. But as much as anti-immigration we're seeing so many people who are more supportive. Like for our refugee program now, people just want to adopt families, they want to help. So it's really kind of, it's always been there, but I think it's just kind of, there were so many factors that made it.
And how do you reconcile when we look, we were just talking earlier that Anthony Bourdain did a special about Houston, and all he did was focus on immigrants and the diversity of Houston. And how do you reconcile where we have a city like Fort Bend County, the most diverse county in America, Houston, a very diverse city, and diverse because so many new immigrants, and yet we still have Senate Bill 4, the sanctuary city. How do you reconcile that a state can have that?
Because part of the problem I feel is that even though we're the most diverse, and actually Houston is not really like the rest of Texas, but in some areas, first of all, you have no diversity, and second, they're not really part of the actual decision makers. So it's really about voice and about political power too. So you have a group that controls and make all the decisions for the vast majority. But also at the same time, what I've seen recently, and part of it because of the work of the Dreamers. And even after, the airport stuff, so immigrants used to be really afraid because immigration is a privilege. So, if they are undocumented, these were kids who were brought by their parents when they were, young, and
sometimes babies, right?
Some of them were babies, but they, they come in, and some of them thought they were Americans until they grew up and had to apply for college, and then they discovered, I don't have status, I don't have existence, and then they have to live in the shadow. And President Obama had created this program called DACA, which is really all it gives them is work permit. but it changed their lives, completely. So you have all these young people who grew up here now can work and get driver's license, and we've actually hired several of them, and we have been doing a lot of work with that. And one of the first things that everybody was afraid of, because the president kept saying that he will stop the DACA, but I mean, I know that he decided not to stop it, but in some sense, he stopped it because it's taking so long now to get renewals for these young kids.
Yeah.
So, I mean, then they lose their ability to work, really, and to work legally.
Yeah.
But even getting the president to create that program was due to their advocacy. I mean, so they were out there, they shared their stories, and showed how much they're part of this country. So I think, it's, as I said, threats or dangers or, kind of bad laws also create a lot of advocacy. But the other thing I think that has been very effective and really kind of, gives me hope at least, is how much litigation, the impact litigation, that has been going on, because that's kind of what stopped a lot of these draconian, kind of measures,
Right.
whether it's about refugees or whether it's about, allowing people to come in. And I think that, it just has to be done in all ways. So there is kind of advocacy, there is, litigation, there are services, and we all need to continue to work. But I'm just hopeful that this will not continue forever, and that ultimately people will realize how much immigrants bring to our lives.
But it seems like we're reminded a lot lately of how much immigrants bring, and how many of us can only go back a couple of generations and we can see that we're families of immigrants. It seems to me in some ways that there hasn't been as much outrage as I would have expected. Do you find the same?
Well, within the circles I know with, it's very, but
But outside that community.
Well, the truth is, it always amazes me. Like, I also am very involved in the Arab Cultural Center.
Yeah.
And I realized that
Are they outraged?
Well, not all of them, because those who have been here a long time, they don't even feel that there's a change.
Yeah.
And somehow they come to think, well, now we're Americans and we're not going to be affected. I do a lot, and sometimes people don't like what I say. I say, it doesn't matter to them. You look different. Ultimately, you're going to be stopped at the airport. So there needs to be a lot of more, kind of advocating. But the other problem that I see is that a lot of people who have very conservative fiscal views kind of, I don't know, it affects how they look at immigration, and there's not enough information how much even economically that the immigrants bring. Like, sometimes I think if you look all around, all of these, workers in the street, in the heat, are immigrants. And if you deport all of them, everything will stop. I don't think people, but there's also an element of using them, because, they are cheap labor. They don't have rights. They can not give them their. So, all of these things together. But you're right. I feel like people felt that there's enough litigation that will save all of us, and I don't think this is true. Especially with what happened in Houston, the community has been really advocating, and they have been talking to the legislation. But you have these people who are not in tune, don't understand the needs of the community, but they are the ones in power, and they are making these changes. The only way to change that is for people to be involved in the political, process more. Like I've never really voted in the local, I can tell you, in the local elections. I just don't, I'm too busy, I don't think of it. But then I live in Pearland, and there was, we've had this 80-year-old, mayor, and now we had a young man who's 36, who's an African American, and a woman who's actually covered for city council. So, for the first time I felt, I'm one voice, but at least,
And you also had a school board candidate who made anti-Islamic
remarks. Absolutely. Everybody is making these remarks. And the talk
But he was
about
defeated for that, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of what will make the real difference. That enough good people. At the conference, one of the things that were said is that what really hurts more is when good people don't speak up. I mean, there's always going to be bad rhetoric, but I think it's up to the people who believe in freedom, who believe in America being the beacon for refugees and for, asylum seekers, need to speak up.
It's very clear when we talk about immigration and immigration laws that immigration hasn't been reformed and fixed in a long time, right? It's like a stalemate on each side. If you were to be the president for a day or queen for a day, where you got to decide how immigration should look in the United States, what should it look like? What would be a fair thing to do around immigration?
Well, I mean, to start with is to really reform the system to make it more to look more about families. So we as a nation, we talk about the importance of families, and we talk about how we should not break them. But when you look at actually the state immigration is, so you have, mixed families. Kids are U.S. citizens, the parents are undocumented, or some of the children were born here, they're citizens, the others are undocumented, and we're breaking all these families, and actually we don't have options for them to apply. So like everybody keeps saying, I mean, they're violating the law, they're being illegal, but there is no actual...
They need to go back to their own country and get in line, right?
But in 1996, when they passed the IRA kind of law, if anybody leaves and they have been here undocumented for less than a year, they can't come for 3 years. More than a year, 10 years. So imagine, I mean, so this is one. Also the backlog. So somebody in, Mexico who's a permanent resident applying for his young kid and wife, they have to wait sometimes for 10, 15 years in order to get a visa to be able to come. So all of these things, and there are small fixes, like there was 245I that allowed people who had violations to waive in and get. So there are some very small things that can be done immediately, but also get rid of all these waitings and numbers, and deal with people more humanely. Like instead, so now they remove all discretion. And they look at the numbers in terms, so every country has 20,000, while in some countries you don't feel that, and in others like Mexico, or Philippines, people wait forever. So a lot of these things, I mean, if you look at them, but it needs really complete reform, looking at, what is good, and also look at what is good for the country, because they keep saying we want more, those who have high skills, which is very important. And I mean, the U.S. is not doing well in technology and all of that, and they need them. But they also need actual workers. So if they create for them a process where they can come work and go back to their country, but no, I mean, once they come in, if they leave, they're never coming back, or they're considered to have self-deported, and then the 10 years will apply for them. So there's a lot that can be done. I mean, and again, I feel like this country has always stood for principles of due process and freedom. And we have to have our laws reflect that. I mean, when I'm in court representing clients, lots of times even judges who are administrative judges tell me, well, international law does not apply. Well, this is our obligation towards that we've signed. So a lot of these things can be changed.
I want to go to the Valley. Down in the Rio Grande Valley, I've been a couple of times where you see the children's surge, right? The kids that are coming across our border from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. And if you go to Catholic Charities in McAllen, Texas, and they have the nuns there, have that huge shelter where all the families come through. One year, a couple of years I was down there were 67,000 kids that came through that 1 year. They think the number might be larger this year. I don't know how the Trump stuff has affected that, but from the perspective of those children who are fleeing violence, what can they hope for in the United States? And what does current law do to stop them, and what are their choices? Sure.
So, I mean, even when you talk about children, there are two kind of categories. So if the child comes unaccompanied by an adult, I mean,
of which there are many,
the parents, and many of them. So once they cross and they're apprehended by the Border Patrol.
And for these kids, many times, they're looking for the Border Patrol,
I mean,
right?
usually,
Yeah.
I mean, it's very hard not to because,
Yeah.
I mean, the minute they come in. So they are taken into the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And the Office of Refugee Resettlement have contracts with a lot of nonprofits to have shelters that provide more, like children friendly. It's still detention. I mean, I remind everybody that they're still detained, but at least it's really different. And then now with especially the funding that is available, all of these kids get at least an attorney to assess their case, and and now there is also funding even when they are reunified with their parents to continue with the funding. So, but that doesn't mean that we're serving all of them. So, like last year, they said there were 7,000 in Texas, and there were 4,000 in Houston, and we have the biggest capacity for that. Now we have around 1,000 cases open, but what about the 3,000? So the YMCA has an attorney and a caseworker. Kind has 15, and they serve like maybe 300 or so. So there's a lot of kids who don't get served still. Even when they are working with the attorney, the laws are so restrictive in terms of asylum based on gang or the fear of returning is very difficult to prove. I mean, we've had the last month 5, and I can't tell you how much we celebrated them because they're very hard to get. And then there was another avenue for them to get special immigrant juvenile status that requires to go to state court to get dependent. We're seeing a pushback from the judges. I mean, their role is to determine is it in their best interest to be returned? I mean, they're doing things that family law judges really do, determining can they be, have they been abused, abandoned, or neglected. But they keep thinking, well, you're doing this to get legal status. And, so it's really very hard to get. They're asking for more and more every day. I had a judge actually tell me that Catholic Charities, I had to go because the attorneys were not getting anything, so I went to try and explain. So she's telling me, you're bringing refugees who don't qualify for refugee status. And I explained, Wafa does not decide that. This is decided by the United Nations High Commissioner, and then USCIS interview them, and they bring them. So she didn't even want us to do, to get them, to have somebody to take care of, managing conservatorship. That's what she didn't. So that's also, so even if they have the representation, it's very hard. But those who don't really don't have any chance. They end by either getting deportation orders in absentia, or if they're caught, they're deported and brought back to the violence, the fear of death, and not being able to survive.
What percentage of those kids will be sent back, do you think, Wafa?
I am not sure exactly, but it's not a big, kind of number. But I can tell you, I mean, less than half, maybe 30 to 35% are the ones who get, legal relief that enables them to stay. But then I talked about another group. So if the kid happens to be with a single mother, let's say,
and that happens a lot as well.
Which happens a lot. A lot of them also came.
That's all those families in Catholic Charities are all with the parents,
So these now have been detained, and they're put in, different detention centers all over the country, and where they don't have even access for attorneys. I mean, so and their cases are much harder. And just to give you an idea, in Houston, for instance, somebody files for asylum, there is a wait of 2 to 3 years for the case to be determined. So now think of all these new orders, executive orders and new memos, they're going to be detained all this time. So lots of people just give up and want to go back to where they are, number one. And, the other thing that part of the memos say that even for unaccompanied minors, after they're released to their parents, which is done, kind of parents or family members, their case, their status will be redetermined. So they do not stay as an unaccompanied minor, so they lose a lot of the protections that are available. But that's kind of the story of immigration, to tell you the truth. There's reasonable categories that put some people in a place where they don't have resources. There are no resources for these. I can tell you, like at Catholic Charities, I'm constantly looking for resources for these adult asylum cases, and there's really none. So.
We have, you mentioned this earlier, we have 11 million people living in our country that are undocumented in some way. Are we creating amongst them and their American relatives, in a sense, sort of this paranoid nation where afraid of the police, afraid of medical people who might report them, afraid of anyone in authority that might sort of take action against them?
Actually, that's what we're seeing in the community, immigrant community right now. Because as I said, I mean, the increase in rates, deputizing local police. So they're afraid to report crimes. They're afraid to go to their, regular reporting with enforcement. Think of the trauma for children when every day they go to school, they're not sure that their parents will come pick them up. They can be deported any day. And a lot of people who work with schools that have a lot of Central American kids, kids who are even in kindergarten cry sometimes because they're afraid their mom or dad is going to be deported. So,
This is something we're hearing a lot from schools.
This is real fear. It's not like some people think, no, nothing happened. A lot has happened, and people are really afraid, day in, day out. And there is real danger of them being picked up any moment. So.
And are there a lot of people being picked up and deported who haven't committed a crime?
We don't have really actual numbers, but we are hearing a lot of anecdotes regarding that. We even at Catholic Charities, we had a kid who we were representing, and his case got denied, so we filed an appeal. And then the government, really deported him. So we, our attorney filed with them and told them, you have deported, and now they brought him back. But think of all these people who have no attorneys, who have nobody to fight for them. This is happening every day. And the other really kind of thing that frightens people the most is that in the past, in order for somebody to be deported, there was more of a due process. Supervisors were involved. Now it's a decision by a deportation officer. So some of them were really kind of very upset about the priorities, the former priorities. So the minute now these priorities are removed, they see their job as deporting. There's some, I'm not saying all of them. They work hard, and a lot of them want to give people the right. But if you don't have due process, then there's no protection really for anybody.
And you talked earlier about people need to speak up, but I think in the advocacy community, is there more that we can be doing in the fight for sort of fair immigration?
I think that there needs, it's still only done by those who are either working in the field or those who are affected. I feel like it needs to be everybody speaking up. And also, kind of for those who make decisions about, legislation like SB4, they have to find consequences that the people need to tell them, that's not why we elected you, and you're not going to stay if you continue to do that. But and that's kind of what I feel is missing. And I tell you, I get really busy with the actual service every day, but I have been a lot more involved with advocacy issues like for refugees as well as for immigrants, and I saw how much is missing. It's kind of, a lot of people just really don't know or don't care or don't have time to do it. And I think it's really about who we are as people and what we stand for and how we want to see our kids grow in what kind of country. Is it a country where, if you're either colored or you don't have status, you have no place, and you don't really kind of exist, and you have to live in the shadows? And even from a security point of view, do you want people that you don't know who they are? The more that you give them a chance to get out of the shadows, and it's you create safer communities, I feel.
I want to ask one more question, then I want to open it up to the audience. But we talked earlier about the travel ban, and its impact on Muslims that wanted to come to our country. As you read these things, it seems to me that if you're in a refugee camp in Jordan, and you've escaped Syria, and you go through, I read some 21 different interviews
Absolutely,
and background
and 2 to 3
checks.
years.
And it takes that long. How is it that that is not careful enough? Because our government is saying that we need to stop doing that because we haven't been careful enough.
Well, I think part of what I hear. First of all, this is complete misinformation. So, people are not vetted. Nobody comes into the country as a refugee without going through all this vetting process. Now, but there are also two issues there. They come from countries that now there is a breakdown in, systems. So I think they're using that as an excuse that, well, we don't have, data that we could rely on. Yes, from the countries you don't, but going through all this intensive, and there is so many levels of interviews, number one. Number two, I think it's like this whole idea is we're going to prevent anything from happening. You can never prevent everything from happening because people could go, have a psychotic, breakdown. And a lot of what happens with these situations is not that they are really terrorists. A lot of it, if you look at the root of it, they either have, issues, psychological issues, or they have been through kind of bad experiences. But then, they use these stories to highlight. And even part of the funding that the new administration is intending to give voice, they say, to victims of those who were killed by, unauthorized, immigrants. But there's so many amazing stories about immigrants who have saved life, who have, so it's really a lot about all this misinformation that is filling all the news. And speaking of Jordan, I always, when they had all this outpouring of 60,000 or 65,000 people from Central America who really kind of fall under the definition of refugee, but politically we've decided they're not refugees, so that's kind of the issue. I was at a conference in DC and someone said something. They said, Jordan is 4 million, so now they're taking care of 1 million Syrian refugees, and they're managing. But here, look at the US and how many people we have and all the resources. We describe 65,000 as being a surge, as being an invasion. There were some really politicians. So it's really all about, the attitude or how you view them. If you view them as the other, if you view them as danger, if you just don't want to be really providing safe haven, then even 10 people become too much.
Yeah.
So, but
it was. I go to Sweden sometimes. My wife has relatives there, and I think it's Sweden accepts more immigrants per capita than the United States does. And it was very interesting when I mentioned something about Syrian immigrants there last year. They said, oh yeah, we love getting Syrian immigrants because they're very educated, they're doctors, engineers, and I thought it was, what a different mindset from
and we who work with refugees and immigrants, they're very hardworking people. They, a lot of them, they either have skills or they have education, and they work very hard because, for them, it's a matter of, life or death. They don't, and they keep talking about immigrants taking all the resources. They don't have access to really any of the federal money except if as refugees, and misinformation and really rhetoric that awakens what is not good in us. All these racial differences, this sense of superiority. That we're better and we're the only ones who deserve to live, and so